This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Today we're going to cover the book Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me, by Tavris Elliot Aronson, a book focused on the reasons why we justify foolish beliefs, bad decisions, and hurtful acts. Peter Attia recommended the book in Tools of Titans. He is a former ultra-endurance athlete. He also was one of two people who suggested our 10th book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. So we've met him before here in our podcast. He's Tim Ferriss's go-to doctor for anything performance or longevity related. And I wanted to highlight a quote from Tools of Titans where Attia talks about this book and the reason that he suggested it. Mistakes Were Made is a book about cognitive dissonance that looks at common weaknesses and biases in human thinking. Peter, and then this is Tim talking about this book. Peter wants to ensure he goes through life without being too sure of himself, and this book helps him to recalibrate. The book was written by Tavris and Elliot Aronson. Carol's a social psychologist, lecturer, and writer, and Elliot is an eminent social psychologist, scientific researcher, teacher, and writer. I thought they had a interesting little tidbit in the back of the book in their section of acknowledgments. And they said, we decided the order of authorship of this book by flipping a coin. It's that balanced a collaboration. So that was cool. So we'll head right into the overview and initial reactions, and then work our way into some of our favorite quotes. So my overview, I thought the book was helpful on many fronts. It hits on some of the topics we've seen in some of the other books of Titans. One of those being small decisions, the daily habits, the daily decisions that we make, and how those impact. A lot of times it's not the big bangs, but it's the small, seemingly insignificant decisions that we make. It's also initial decisions. There was a few different parts of the book where they talked about Nixon, and in one part in particular, a guy by the name of Magruder started working for Nixon, and Magruder went all in on the bad stuff that went on.
The dirty tricks.
But
I am not a crook.
There was like a part of meeting Nixon and just getting so enthralled by Nixon, and if in that initial decision, and he saw some stuff right at the beginning that he didn't like, this Magruder guy, but he was just enthralled by the whole thing and being able to work for Nixon and that sort of thing, to where even though he saw things, and it wasn't even necessarily with Nixon at that point, but someone else in the group saw things he didn't like, but just kept going. And he said, or the authors of the book said, that it was that initial decision that led, and it made the decisions after that a lot easier. So the importance of making the right initial decision, which isn't always easy. Slope. Yeah, but one
of the things I really liked about this book is the image of the pyramid, the decision pyramid. You know, you start standing on that moral high ground, standing on the tip of it, and then you make one decision and you step a little brick down, and then by the end you're all the way at the bottom of the pyramid and justifying horrible things pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of your initial reactions to the book? Well,
first of all, I mean, this book, as someone who's taught in the social sciences, taught my share of sociology classes and so on, this book is right up my alley. I mean, dealing with things like confirmation bias and selection bias, and what they refer to throughout the book as self-justification, all the effort that we make to get ourselves to protect our own self-image and our own narrative of who we are and all that stuff. that stuff is stuff that, this is professionally right up my alley. I mean, this is what I'm constantly dealing with. It's what I'm always wanting to get students to think about, get people to think about. It's something that I'm constantly conscious of in my own life, and always concerned about. Okay, am I thinking this because of confirmation bias? Am I thinking this because? And this book does a great job of breaking down in a popular way how the research has what the research looks like in this area, and how people need to be aware of all of the ways that their shortcuts, their mental heuristics can short circuit and cause all sorts of issues in terms of judgment, all sorts of problems in terms of how we perceive other people, impact the way we remember things. All of these sorts of things are things that ordinarily people don't think about, people aren't even aware of, and then they dramatically impact the way that the decisions that we make, the way that we think about other people, the way that we think about policies in the political sphere, all sorts of stuff. And this is, I mean, to be honest, this is the kind of book. This is a book that I wish was on those summer reading lists, for the required reading lists for high schools, that they always do. This is the kind of book that should be required summer reading for every high school in the country, because this is the sort of stuff that people don't realize about how their memories work, about how they think about stuff. And once you realize it, and once you actually buy it, once you actually understand that this is how your mind plays tricks on you, and this is how these are flaws. Now they can actually serve good function in some ways, but they're flaws in the way that we think about so much, and they limit how we think. It's only once you start to realize that you can get beyond and fix some of that stuff, and again, think scientifically, as they talk about, to avoid the kind of epistemological arrogance that we're all prone to, in thinking that, my perspective's right because that's what I remember and all this, and remembering that, actually my memory may be flawed by my perspective. Or maybe that other person who takes a different view than I do on this one thing, the reason isn't because they're a bad person. It just might be that they remember something a little differently, or they have a little bit of a different way of thinking about it that isn't just wrong because they're evil, but rather because they're a person just like me, and, we have limitations in these things. Mm-hmm. So, I've long thought that, teaching the cognitive biases that exist, and basic statistics, or less so the math itself in terms of statistics, but how to understand statistics, how do statistics work, and how to break down, how to understand a scientific article, how to assess claims and things like that. Statistically minded thinking should be taught in every high school. I mean, it just should be taught in every high school everywhere,
along with how to do a budget.
Yeah, exactly. That's another one. I mean, but these are those things that people need to have understanding of how this works, really, to function adequately and function well as citizens. I mean, these are the sorts of things people need.
All right, so
I mean this, along with with rhetorical fallacies, how to make a budget, statistical thinking, this stuff is critical.
So last week you had a lot of problems with what he wrote about the historical accuracy. Was the research good in this book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This book is cutting edge social science research. This is whereas last week's Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, I did ding it a good bit because the historiography, the historical method, and all that, and many of the facts were really sloppy. It wasn't especially well done in that regard, despite being a really good narrative. Mm-hmm. This one is very much the opposite. I mean, this book it sets a good standard for how to take academic or scholarly research and put it in digestible form for a popular audience. I mean, they've done an excellent job with that throughout this book. A few times it could have been shortened just a little bit, or they do it a little differently than I would have. But this is very well done in that regard. Now, granted, on the flip side, there is a bit of a crisis in social science research, particularly in psychology, where a lot of studies have been called. The results of a lot of studies have been called into question due to p-hacking and other sorts of scientific malpractice, basically, where the people who were running studies basically were using statistical sleight of hand and so on, even oftentimes even without realizing they were doing it, which is perfectly ironic and makes the point of this book.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even where those studies don't hold up necessarily as well now. This book shows exactly why that sort of thing can and does happen, but there's a bit of a crisis in that. But even where they've some of the studies that they reference, some of the individual studies may not end up holding up. I mean, I don't know exactly which ones. I didn't spend too much time with that, but some of them may not end up holding up. Lots of them, like the famous Milgram study. I mean, that stuff is about as established as you're going to get in the social sciences. I mean, it's cutting edge.
Okay, good. And what's really funny, I just finished reading book 36, which is the Power of Persuasion, and a lot of overlap with this book. And they go into quite a large section of that the shock test thing, and they said that test was repeated in many other countries, and it was never under 50% of the people who wouldn't do the shocking or asked to leave early. So in every country they've done it, in every test, it's always been over 50%. So I found that interesting. And then they said the original point of that test was to see the thinking was that the rate would be a lot lower in the U.S. This is according to the Power of Persuasion book, and so they thought they would see a lower percentage of people that would go along with the torture of torturing of other people, and then they wanted to go to Germany and do the same test to see why in the German culture the Nazis could have come out of that, but they didn't do that second part of the test because the rate was so high in the U.S. in that first test that it was like, oh, okay, everybody's like that. This is a human condition. This is not Germans versus everyone else. So
yeah, I mean, it's just it's learning that people don't commit these atrocities and so on because they're monsters, but rather because they're just like us, and that's the really, really frightening thing that a lot of people don't like to come to grips with.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll start out with quotes. I'll start out with my first one, and it's towards the end of the book. Something we did can be separated from who we are and who we want to be. I thought this was a really interesting quote because it came in a part of the book where they were talking about one of the U.S. Army guys who was in Iraq and was in the prison where they were doing the torturing of the Iraqi prisoners.
Abu Ghraib.
And so he was one of the guys that was torturing these prisoners. And he now goes around and he speaks at high schools and things like that and talks about what he did. But he talks about it in the past tense. He says, I tortured. He doesn't go around saying I'm a torturer. And so this idea that something we did can be separated from who we are and who we want to be. And that's been part of this guy's healing process of almost of a confession of a way of look, I did this. I'm being upfront that I did this. I'm not trying to hide it, but that's not who I am.
Yeah, it's not me. No, it's not me. I did those things, but it's certainly that's not who I envision myself as.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for my first one, then I'm going to go ahead and I think this one was on your list too. But if it is, I'm going to steal it from you. because it's one that I really liked, and that is, doubt is not the enemy of justice. Overconfidence is. And that's one of the things that they really spend a lot of time on in this particular book is looking at how our overconfidence about what we think we know, what we think we remember, causes so many problems, because that stuff's more malleable by our image of ourselves and by the stories that we tell ourselves, and it can cause serious problems, breach of justice. And that's one of the things. I mean, this book, the chapter that this comes in, is on miscarriages of justice, where people got convicted of crimes that they didn't commit as a result, in large part, of this self-reinforcing, what they continue to call self-justification, where people get an idea in their heads, or they latch on to one specific detail of something, and then everything else that they find goes toward confirming what they already knew, or rather, what they thought they already knew.
Yeah, that was a great chapter, the law and disorder.
Yeah, and a frightening one, really.
Pretty scary too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they do a great job of highlighting why. Well, really, I mean, this goes back to why the U.S. system was set up, so that beyond if it's not established beyond a reasonable doubt, somebody gets off. And of course, we've tried all sorts of ways to get around that, and the ways to get around that are the things that lead to all sorts of breaches of ethics and all this, and they are the things that end up getting innocent people put behind bars or put to death. And they do a great job of showing how that works. And and yet we always are trying to, as they point out, we're always trying to eliminate doubt, as though doubt is the thing that prevents justice. And they're saying, no. It's actually overconfidence in what we think we know that leads to miscarriage of justice more often than not. It's not a matter of not having since we're letting doubt govern things, then we're not going to get justice carried out. No, that's not really what the most likely result is there. And actually, it was interesting to consider this in light of some of the current brouhaha about recently Betsy DeVoe rescinding the Dear Colleague letter to higher ed. And this is something that, obviously, again, I'm pretty familiar with on a couple different ends, but rescinding the Dear Colleague letter about sexual assault on college campuses. And previously, the Dear Colleague letter had told college campuses to no longer apply the standard of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but rather to make their decisions on the basis of a preponderance of evidence. So, don't let the fact that you doubt, that you have some reasonable doubt on whether or not this person was actually a perpetrator of sexual violence. Even if you have doubt, even if you have reasonable doubt, if you think that it's a little bit more likely that that some form of sexual violence happened, then take action. Well, that is there's a problem in lacking due process there, and the reason that those due process pieces exist to begin with is because of these exact things that are covered in this book, in terms of the way that memories can be faulty, the way that all sorts of things can result in miscarriage of justice. And frankly, we should get more concerned with those things, not less, in our pursuit of justice.
All right, my next one is the mind wants to protect, the soul wants to confess. That made me think of crime.
You stole that one from me.
Crime and Punishment. Oh, did I? Oh, yeah, I see.
Oh, yeah, it's down there.
Yeah, well, why don't you read the full? Why don't you read the full, because I kind of cut that one a little bit.
Yeah. The fuller quote is, "The mind wants to protect itself from the pain of dissonance with the balm of self-justification, but the soul wants to confess." I love it.
Yeah,
it's
excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all do tend to do this. I mean, that's the thing. We all tend to defend our own self-image by bowing up when something else from the outside is presented as evidence. You did this, or you always do that. Think about how you naturally respond with that. And their point is, yeah, actually, sometimes it's easier just to admit that you were wrong and not keep tying yourselves in knots yourself in knots to try to protect your self-image. Just get to the place where instead of defending yourself, instead of expending all that effort to defend your self-narrative, just say, oh, I was wrong, and all of a sudden you get relief.
Yeah, I was wondering though about, because I didn't see a lot of discussion about confession or a repenting of what had been done in the book, and it seems like but it seems like that would be a big part of what they were talking about in a way to not undo but to take a different course than going down these roads. But maybe it was just beyond the scope of the book. But that is something that stuck out to me in the book. It was like, where's the information on coming to terms with these things? And I thought they got to it a little bit with my first quote, where they were talking about the guy who would say I tortured, and instead of saying I'm a torturer. But that was one thing that stuck out to me when I was reading the book.
Yeah, and I do think they certainly don't spend as much time on this as they do the rest, and I think it's partly because, like you said, it is sort of beyond the scope of the book to try to prove that cathartic capacity or the inclination of the soul to catharsis. But what they do in this passage is they say, again, the rest of the passage is, to reduce dissonance, most of us put an enormous amount of mental and physical energy into protecting ourselves and propping up our self-esteem when it sags under the realization that we've been foolish, gullible, mistaken, corrupted, or otherwise human. And yet, much of the time, all this investment of energy is surprisingly unnecessary. And then they point to examples from prior chapters. This person's still doing fine. In fact, doing better than before. Admitted the guilt. This person also doing better, still successful. This person got her parents back. This person, was promoted because of after admitting wrong. So, you don't have to protect yourself all the time in order to get the benefits. And in fact, you won't be spending all of that extra energy trying to maintain your self-image. So I think that's how they do it. There's not as much reason to focus on that aspect of it, because what they're trying to do is show the reader these are the places where your shortcuts short circuit, and they do that throughout, and that's really the point of emphasis.
You want to do one more of yours, and then I'll hit my next one.
Sure. So another short one. How in the world can they live with themselves? The answer is exactly the way the rest of us do. The reason they can sleep at night is exactly the same reason we can. And again, this is the sort of thing that how could they have done? How could the Nazis have done all of those awful things and justified that? The same way that we justify what we do.
Yep.
And this is, again, it's a hard lesson for us to recognize, but if we understand the ways that we excuse our own behavior and the ways that we shortcut and get to where we can make sure that we preserve our own self-image as good people, that actually can help us actually be those good people by learning where we're deceiving ourselves in some cases and being on the lookout for it.
My next one is, while inebriation makes it easier for people to reveal their prejudices, it doesn't put those attitudes in their minds. That was so good. I just sorry, Mel Gibson, but I was thinking of that.
Well,
his tirade.
They brought up Gibson in that section.
Yeah, but whenever someone does that, they say, "Whoa, I was drunk," or it was the beer talking. Yeah, but
yeah, it wasn't me. It was the alcohol.
It makes it easier for them to reveal their prejudices, but it doesn't put them in their minds.
Yeah, I remember, a while back, one of the studies on all this, basically saying, listen, you don't go to bed with someone because you're drunk. It just lowers your inhibitions a little.
Yeah.
No, just to be fair, I'm not talking about, blacked out drunk or whatever. I mean, those are rape situations. It's a different thing. But I'm talking about, you get a little bit buzzed or whatever, and then you wind up in somebody else's bed. Well, that's not the alcohol. That's just you.
Well, and the great philosopher Homer Simpson, who said alcohol is the cause and solution to all life's problems.
To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, I don't have my full voice here recording at this moment, but I've been yelling at a bunch of high schoolers, trying to get them together for special teams period and during practice and all. Yes, everybody, I do. Also coach some high school football on the side as one of my other side gigs. So, yeah.
And he does voice work.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's always that, too. So, hey, if you're listening to this show and you need any sort of voice work, then feel free to give me a call. I'll make sure that the voice work is done as well as possible. I'd be happy to do anything, no matter how precious it is. So, yeah, we'll just leave that there. But I'm going to go ahead and get to my next quote. This one I chosen a little bit more for its humor than for say the life lesson. But
so is this the one where the kids should put earmuffs on?
Yeah. This is the one where if you have small children or sensitive ears in the room, you might want to skip about 30 seconds forward. Maybe a minute. Anyway, the quote is, technically, of course, McDougal is right. Kreiner could have raped the woman in Texas and ejaculated somewhere else. Arkansas, perhaps. And this, of course, is in the chapter about DNA showing that people who had been previously convicted were, in fact, innocent of the crimes that they'd been convicted of. And this was a case where after the DNA showed that the person convicted of a rape and murder it didn't match this person, the prosecutor said, well, it means that the sperm found in her was not his. It doesn't mean he didn't rape her. Doesn't mean he didn't kill her. And their response was, well, technically, of course, he's right. But, come on. This is self-justification to the nth degree. I mean, unbelievable that you would say that. And their point is, well, people use DNA on the front end. Prosecutors use it very much on the front end, very differently than they do in the back end once they're sure they got the right conviction. Yeah, once again, a really, really good chapter on miscarriages of justice.
And Trump's name comes up in that chapter.
Yeah, it's kind of been surprising how often he's come up in these books, all of which are written before his run.
Not in a positive light.
Yeah.
And it's fun. I mean, he keeps coming up. He's in some of the more recent books, too. And
yeah, and these are not, political opponents.
Yeah.
Never in a positive light. Yeah. It's just maybe there's something going on there, but never mind. I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Well, I'm cheating with my next one here because this is a quote of someone else, but it's quoted in this book, so I thought it's fair game. This comes from Lord Molson. I don't know who that is, but he said, "I will look at any additional evidence to confirm the opinion to which I already have come."
Yep.
So at least he's being honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot more honest than the rest of us tend to be. So, yeah, give him credit for that. And I'll go ahead and do my next one really quickly. This is a fast one. Even irrefutable evidence is rare. Even irrefutable evidence is rarely enough to pierce the mental armor of self-justification. Most people, when directly confronted by evidence that they are wrong, do not change their view or course of action, but justify it even more tenaciously. And the data are very clear on this. I mean, there's numerous studies that show that people who have their minds made up on an issue or find out something that sets their mind, they get disconfirming results or they get disconfirming evidence, and shockingly, but not surprisingly, once you understand the mechanisms, they latch on to their bad information even more.
All right, my last one. That is why history is written by the victors, but it's the victims who write the memoirs. I thought it was a funny quote because it's like the first line of Braveheart, where they talk about history being written by the winners of battles and not the losers. But they played off that idea and said, but the victims get to write the memoirs.
And that's especially true now that we have a whole lot more options to get perspectives out there. That said, I mean, there have been some other examples of actually victims writing history. I mean, the Hebrew Bible is, those are not the winners that are writing the Hebrew Bible, at least on a global perspective. But yeah, for the most part, it's an interesting piece. So let's go ahead and move into my last quote here, which is, at its core, therefore, science is a form of arrogance control.
I had that in my favorite quotes, and I took it out.
Yeah, and of course they specify that that is science properly done, rather than what goes on oftentimes under the name of science, where you have all of these self-justifying biases actually underway. Again, looking at a lot of the issues in terms of modern the modern crisis or the present crisis in social science research about repeatability and all sorts of things where people hacked their data, whether knowingly in some cases or unknowingly as a result of being governed by their biases. So, but either way, one of the things that so what they emphasize here is the rest of the quote leading up to that is, the scientific method consists of the use of procedures designed to show not that our predictions and hypotheses are right, but that they might be wrong. Scientific reasoning is useful to anyone in any job because it makes us face the possibility, even the dire reality, that we were mistaken. It forces us to confront our self-justifications and put them on public display for others to puncture. At its core, therefore, science is a form of arrogance control. And again, I think the purpose here is to get people to think with the scientific method, to think about what disconfirming evidence might be out there that I haven't considered, and I need to be willing to address those potential disconfirmations if I'm going to hold to any view. And once again, that's a really, really important lesson, and it's important for those who actually work in science as well. So yeah, one of my favorite quotes.
That was good. And back to the title of the book, Mistakes Were Made. They do a funny part where they do some quotes from different politicians where mistakes were made is a very common word that comes out of the White House, and so that's where they got the title of the book. But it's pretty funny to see how often that gets said. But it's, as you can tell, mistakes were made is not very personal. It's not I made a mistake. It's mistakes were made, and then obviously their tagline for the book, but not by me.
So let's go ahead and move into a little bit into the more into the closer analysis portion of the podcast, looking a little bit more closely at some of the key themes of the book rather than just some of those quotes. And I know, Eric, you had wanted to, based on the show notes, you had wanted to start on talking about the importance of small decisions. So let's go ahead and start there.
Yeah, and I hit on this a little bit at the beginning, but it just made me think so much of how important character is, how important making the right decision is at the very beginning, because this book kind of keeps presenting situations where people don't even know that they're getting sucked into something until it's too late, or until they're really, really deep into it. But if they had been able to say no at the beginning, if they had had the character or the courage to say no right when things were getting wrong, or where they knew something wasn't right, it would have saved a lot of time. So, or a lot of heartache. And so, yeah, we've come across this a lot in the other Books of Titans books, and so I thought it was neat to see it in this context, and in really putting a lot of importance on the small decisions, and not thinking that everything important in life is going to be some huge deal or huge decision, but the small decisions you make by yourself, that no one else sees, and the decisions you make on a daily basis. So I thought it was interesting seeing it here again.
Yeah, it really is the little decisions, the small decisions that actually set everything else. And I think one of the things that this book reinforces, like you were just saying, is this idea that you have to set the standard of integrity really early, and you have to make sure that you rigorously protect that standard. Otherwise, it's so easy to slip into these just one little decision suddenly changes everything. I mean, you look at, for example, if any of the listeners out there have watched, say, House of Cards on Netflix, you have a politician that makes one little compromise. The person, they got into politics because they wanted to bring real change, and it's a good person. And then you make one little compromise that everybody does, or, there's one personal weakness in some area. And because somebody else finds out about that, suddenly they hold your strings, and now you have to dance when they say dance. Now, all of a sudden, you're well on your way to becoming a corrupt politician because you made one tiny compromise that was not a big deal there, but now that you're, in a more significant position, you don't want that to get out, or something else happens, or you just have built the habits to get to there, and all of a sudden you're a corrupt politician. Or, in this book, the chapter, again, we've talked about it already, the chapter on law enforcement is just frightening. And especially given, the patterns today, the big revelations today that they're showing on through the body cameras and all sorts of various ways that this stuff's getting caught. People have been saying for years that these abuses by law enforcement officers have been happening, but lots of people haven't been willing to believe that because, of course, law enforcement, they're the good guys, and law enforcement believes that they're the good guys, and generally speaking, they're trying to be. But then you look at how various people of color are getting shot, and not just people of color, but that's been something that has the disproportionality of treatment of people from different backgrounds and different appearances and so on. That stuff shows up, and you go, how do you get there? And they've got that whole section on how does a cop become a corrupt cop. You don't go into law enforcement thinking, yeah, I'm going to be a corrupt cop. Right?
So how do you guard against this then? Especially if we're so prone to self-justification, it kind of seems like the best course of action is not to rely on yourself in these types of things. So if you've got, if you know that you're coming up on a decision, is the best way to protect yourself to try to have a partner in crime type thing of
well, not in crime.
Yeah, not in crime, but someone to bounce ideas off, or to be accountable to what you're doing, or because it seems like if you just rely on yourself to make that right first decision, it's not a good thing to rely on. So,
well, I'm not sure that's true, because there are a couple things here. One is the book, I think, makes the point that once you've made that first compromise, you're going to be seriously compromised in your ability to trust any, to trust any decisions you make after that, because you're going to continue to self-justify and all that. But the first decision is precisely where you can have that volition.
Yeah.
It's deciding.
But say for the person that is past that point, is the best thing to then tell somebody, or...
Yeah, that's a hard thing, because as they talk about in the book, even admitting to yourself that I've made compromises that I don't like, that I've done things that I don't like, and that I don't identify as me, that's just shattering to the narrative that we tell ourselves, and it's hard to admit to ourselves.
Yeah. So
the first step, it's not about someone else. It has to be the willingness to actually evaluate oneself honestly. And that starts by, first of all, recognizing that we don't always tell ourselves the truth. And once you recognize, yeah.
And as Feynman said, don't fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool.
Yeah. I mean, and you can see why Attia likes both of these books, and he's batting 1,000 in my book. In my book, in terms of his recommendations, I mean, I think this one's a little better than the other one.
Yeah.
But both of them are really helpful reads in terms of how to think and to make sure that you don't delude yourself and that you don't just follow the crowd and compromise and all this. But I think, again, the first thing is when you have the opportunity to make those first little decisions, you protect every opportunity to be a person of the rigorous integrity that you imagine yourself to be. So you don't administer that, first shock or second shock or whatever. Once you set your boundary, and I'm not going to cross my boundary. What's really easy is, and this is why there's that phenomenon of the auction, the person who wins the auction actually loses, which, as I recall, was mentioned in the book as well. But this idea that if you're no, actually, this wasn't mentioned in the book. It was something else I was reading around the same time. But this idea that if you're on eBay or whatever, it's the paradox of the winner loses, because the person who wins an auction, odds are, paid more than the item is worth, because of the competitiveness and of auctions and the nature of how once you've actually started getting invested in something, you're less willing to give it up. So you may go into the auction saying, well, this is worth $25. And then you get to $25 and you're like, dang it, I thought I was going to get it for $25, but now somebody just bid $25.50. You know what? I'll just bid. It's only $2 more. I'm going to bid $27. Well, you just overpaid by $2. And it's that tendency to let boundaries creep that we have once we're invested that this book is trying to get at in terms of things like integrity, right? Because we tell ourselves stories and then we let our boundaries move and we don't even realize that the boundary has moved because we get involved in the process. So what the first thing is set where your boundary is going to be and don't let that move, even if it's inconvenient, even if it causes personal difficulty. So, again, in the Leo chapter, when they're talking about law enforcement officers, the first time you see your partner plant evidence, that's the moment that you have to make the decision.
Yeah.
Because that moment when you're the rookie cop and you see your partner just happened to drop the bag of drugs there because, well, we know that this perp is guilty, but he just happened to be able to get rid of the drugs right before we got here. We got to make sure we bust him. We're doing the right thing here. And you say, no, I'm not going to tolerate that. Yeah, you know what? You may become a pariah. But if the moment you tolerate that, then the next time you're going to tolerate it. And then the next time, and before long, 10 years later, you're a corrupt cop, completely corrupt.
Yeah.
And it's because you made that one decision. So the first thing is don't make that decision. The second thing is once you make the decision, you've got to make the much harder decision of admitting to yourself, I was unethical. I didn't live up to the standards that I should have. And then trying to deal with that and find some accountability and find a way to start to make amends. That's really hard. And they get to that late in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff.
So yeah, another chapter that we should really talk about that was really, I thought was outstanding was the marriage chapter. And we need to spend a little bit of time there.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed that one immensely. And it was very helpful. And even, I mean, as with all the chapters, there's a lot of examples. And I mean, you can see yourself in the examples. You can see just, even things that you deal with in your own marriage. And so it was very helpful to see that, and then how these people in the example, how they overcame these things. One thing I enjoyed, and I see it in your notes as well, is this ratio of the 5-to-1. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and this is something that's come up. Again, we've talked about how this book is on the bleeding edge of social science research and all of this, and this is one example. And some of this stuff has actually come up fairly recently on the Tim Ferriss podcast as well. where they're talking about where there's been some discussion of romantic relationships and so on, and they pull on the research of a guy named John Gottman, who did this is awesome stuff, where they're talking about basically what causes relationships to end, what poisons romantic relationships, marriage relationships, and so on. And one of the things that Gottman concludes is that the ultimate sign that a relationship is really at its end or is in really bad trouble is contempt. Once you get to the place of contempt, it's really, really bad. And what they do is they connect Gottman's research with this concept of self-justification. And so what they say is, from our standpoint, misunderstandings, conflicts, personality differences, even angry quarrels are not the assassins of love. Self-justification is. And they spend a good bit of the chapter talking about that. And then they bring it back to Gottman, and they say, anger reflects the hope that a problem can be corrected. When it burns out, it leaves the ashes of resentment and contempt is the handmaiden of hopelessness. So then what they do is they talk about how this all works in terms of healthy couples versus unhealthy couples. And this is where the ratio comes in. And they say the tipping point at which a couple starts rewriting their love stories, Gottman finds, again, this is John Gottman, is when the quote-unquote magic ratio dips below 5-1. Successful couples have a ratio of 5 times as many positive interactions, such as expressions of love, affection, and humor, to negative ones, such as expressions of annoyance or complaints. And basically they say, listen, when that positive-negative ratio starts to shift in favor of negative feelings, couples start to resolve the dissonance that's caused by the same events in ways that increases their alienation from one another, whereas when the ratio is higher, it decreases it spirals in the other direction. And this is why a relationship is always either growing or it's growing apart. And the way that they explained this in line with the concept of cognitive dissonance and in terms of how we tend to self-justify and how we tend to give ourselves breaks that we don't necessarily give others, I thought was really, really well done in this chapter.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the comments you had on Once an Eagle and Damon's marriage in that book, and how it is these small things here as well. And you always hear of the 3 main reasons that couples break up: for family, money, and affairs. But that stuff starts here. It starts in the paragraph you just read. It's the small things. It's not, the big bang at the end may be what's the final straw, but I thought this was brilliant in getting to that. And the things you mentioned in Once an Eagle was you could see that relationship kind of falling apart over time based on negative things that had happened and how they had let those things allow them to be angry at each other. And then just that in that case, they weren't spending time with each other either. But I thought that was a neat connection point, and back to that, my first comment of the small decisions and the small everyday things in a marriage and then in life in general.
Yeah, and again, this connects to, a lot of people say, well, the things that cause marriages to go bad, again, what was it? Money, kids, and
family,
and
extended family, and affairs.
And affairs, that's right. What's interesting is Gottman actually says that's not really the case. That he says that the 4 markers of relationship failure are, in fact, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, and contempt is the worst.
Well, and that
so
you're probably
even those other things don't necessarily affect it. It's how you respond to them with criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling that really lead to those things.
And you may be more familiar with this, but there's recent studies too where psychologists could say they could determine the success of a marriage within like a minute, just based on how couples would communicate with each other.
That was actually Gottman's work.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was part of Gottman's work.
Okay.
As I recall, I know that they did a bunch of in-depth interviews of couples, and they basically said after the interviews, here's the ones that are going to work and not, and they had those predicted, and they were 93% accurate.
Jeez.
So yeah, that's pretty high.
Yeah.
And and they actually reference this study in the chapter where they say, the researchers were able to predict with 100% accuracy the 7 couples who divorced.
Wow.
And the place where the 93% comes in is that they'd said that 3 more couples would likely not be together at that point by the time of the second interview. So yeah, that's pretty high results. So this chapter, if nothing else, is worth it for anybody who wants to think about better ways to communicate in their marriage and to think about their spouse and so on. So this is I think a very important chapter that. I've got all sorts of highlights throughout this chapter that are working throughout. And again, I think one of the pieces here is they talk about throughout the book about how cognitive dissonance works in such a way that we constantly give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. And then what they point out is that successful couples actually work in such a way that they extend to each other. So here's the paragraph there. Successful partners extend to each other the same self-forgiving ways of thinking we extend to ourselves. Those couples forgive each other's missteps as being due to this situation, but give each other credit for the loving and thoughtful things they do. And then they go on to say,
they can go the other way.
While happy partners are giving each other the benefit of the doubt, unhappy partners are doing just the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can work the other way too, where you'll forgive others for things that you won't forgive yourself for.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
So it can work both ways, but yeah, great chapter.
Yeah, it's an awesome chapter, and one of the interesting things too that came up in that chapter and that brought up that connects to some of the other pieces in this book about how we rewrite our own memories. Right, that we don't remember the past as accurately as we think we do, particularly when we're not talking about like flashbulb stuff. You remember the birth of your first child or whatever. Yeah, your memory of that's probably pretty accurate. But in general, we are constantly telling ourselves stories, and those stories impact our memories to the point where we sometimes will mix up what actually happened with what with some story and. I could refer to the one chapter as the Tony Anthony chapter, say. There's this quote that where Gottman says, I have found that nothing foretells a marriage's future as accurately as how a couple retells their past. Rewriting history begins even before a couple is aware their marriage is in danger. And so basically this question of like, oh, so how did you meet? And, why did you marry? And what's happened in the last 15 years? How couples frame that and how they tell those stories tells a tremendous amount about where that marriage is headed, because it's our present mindset that's reshaping the way that we remember. So, people remember if things aren't going well, if somebody is not happy, or somebody is starting to pull away from their partner, they're recasting the past as all negative. That to me is a fascinating way that our minds work. So that by the end it's like, well, this was never that great. Mm-hmm. But 20 years ago you might have said it was great.
Yeah. Well, shall we move on?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next subject here.
Okay. I've got one real quick one. They mentioned that in baseball there's 3 main stats for every game: runs, hits, and errors. And I thought it was cool. The way that we presented it was that it's okay to take track of errors, and it's probably a beneficial thing instead of just trying to focus on the good things. Part of maybe moving beyond self-justification and everything is to realize that you will err. There are errors in every game, and they're a big part of the outcome of any given game. And so start keeping track of those, and I guess just beware that you can be fooled, you will be fooled, and get beyond that point, and it's okay to account for the errors.
Well, instead of learning, and I think this is one of the things that they get to as well in a couple other places, is instead of regarding errors as signs that you're stupid or bad, the key thing is to regard errors as keys toward toward learning. And that's one of the most important lessons that we can all get to, right? You don't want to try to avoid errors all the time, because and you don't want to get to the place where you especially don't want to get to the place where you don't recognize that you've made errors when you have, because your mind has concluded that, well, I'm a good guy, I wouldn't make mistakes. I wouldn't make that kind of mistake, so clearly it wasn't a mistake. And that's what we do. So they say, listen, you have to start to accept the fact that errors are a natural thing that constantly happens, because we are not, we're not gods walking around with the capacity to see every possible effect of every decision that we make. And we may make mistakes, but then just admit the mistake and move on and learn from it instead of doubling down on it, because doubling down on it is where the real mistakes start to happen.
Yeah. Well, what else were items that stuck out to you in this one?
One of the other things that I thought was interesting was the chapter that addressed like the memoir of the Holocaust by the guy who had never been, who was actually not a Holocaust victim, who wasn't even Jewish, but he'd basically convinced himself over a number of years, his whole identity had transformed to where he had convinced himself he was a Nazi. A survivor of Nazi oppression as a young Jewish kid, and had been through the concentration camp and wrote all of this stuff out, and wrote a really moving story. And in fact, he wasn't actually there in any of it. He had no it had no relevance to him. But he has gotten to the place where he doesn't believe the disconfirming evidence that it couldn't have happened for him, because it's actually become so wrapped up in him. And you've seen this, I know, previously, and it's again a situation where, is this person lying? Well, yeah, but they're lying to themselves before they're lying to anybody else. And it just happens that narrative that they've come to embrace about themselves, that he's come to embrace about himself, has become that person's identity. It's shaped that person. It's given that person meaning. The character here that they're talking about is this Wilkomirski, who in fact was Bruno Grosjean, was the actual name, that, and eventually that he had come to identify as Benjamin Wilkomirski. And this is all about Fragments, a memoir that was allegedly of his childhood experiences and all this. And there are all sorts of examples that are like this. And what's fascinating is that that when questions were initially brought up about the details on this are questionable, when they actually questioned the people, the psychotherapists and others who had worked with this person, one of them, when the publisher asked, responded, "No, listen, this is a gifted, honest man who had an extraordinarily precisely functioning memory." And then the therapist had written that she hoped any, quote, absurd doubts can be dispelled, end quote, because the publication of the book was very important for Wilkomirski's mental health. It was her wish, she wrote, that fate not overtake him in such a perfidious way, quote, demonstrating to him yet again that he is a nobody, end quote. And see, that's it right there. The reason that this guy ended up inventing this whole story and buying it himself is it was a way for him to convince himself that he was somebody. It was a way of building himself up and making and finding a way of identifying, yeah, this is who I am in this world. And we all do it. We all tell ourselves stories. We all tell ourselves narratives to do that. And I know I've mentioned this previously on this podcast before, but Christian Smith's book on all this is exactly, which we'll put in the show notes again, is exactly about this, about how we tell ourselves stories to find, to teach ourselves who we are and to situate ourselves in the world. I mean, this is the whole concept also of virtue ethics with Alistair McIntyre and all that. And we all do it, maybe not this extremely, but we're all susceptible to this kind of source confusion, which they talk about. That's that concept where suddenly we, and children are especially vulnerable to this. And, again, there's a chapter in there that we should probably talk some about as well, that basically, as people tell you how an event might have happened, it starts to feel real, and then eventually maybe you can't distinguish between the story world that you are inhabiting, maybe through reading a novel or memoirs of someone else, or maybe a dream or whatever. You can't distinguish between that and real memories, and suddenly it becomes a part of who you are, and then it's truth to you, but it's not actually what happened. That to me is we all do it. But the bigger examples that they brought up were really, I think, good ones to show how it can work on the extreme.
And it's interesting for people who are doing that right now as we enter an age of a lot more being searchable and discoverable online, to where a story can be concocted, but it can also be more readily, I guess, verified or not verified. And there's still a lot of gray areas in that, but somebody can tell a story and it can be, whereas in the past, maybe they just moved from a different city and started telling a story to a new group of people. Now that past follows, and it makes for some interest. And at least the example I'm thinking of, it made for an interesting example. So
yeah, it's easier to check and verify certain things now than it used to be. Mm-hmm. So stuff that would have been understood as taken on faith on the basis that this person is passionate and very clearly, this is an emotional memory for this person. Now somebody can verify and check and go, wait, no, that actually happened in a movie that you might have watched as a kid.
Yeah.
But for that person, it's become that person's reality. No, they were actually participating in that movie. They were participating in those events. Well, you can see how that happens. As a kid, you act that out. You get to that place, and then, after a while, your fantasy becomes reality.
Yeah. Well, I've got one item I wanted to ask you about, because this, to me, it was a revelation, I guess, or something that I had not heard before, and that is the notion of repression. So I'm going to read a sentence here in the book. And
you never watched the X-Files, huh?
No. And I had not heard this before, so I wanted to get your thoughts on it. The notion that the mind protects itself by repressing or disassociating memories of trauma, rendering them inaccessible to awareness, is a piece of psychiatric folklore devoid of convincing empirical support. That was the first I'd come across this, and so from what you've read, is this have they kind of gotten rid of the idea of repression?
Yeah, as far as memory, yeah.
Okay.
So what they're talking about is repressed memory. So there's a couple things. One is repression itself, or Verdrängung, or Verdrängung, as it would be said in German. Which Freud wrote in, is a Freudian concept where basically what he's saying is everyone's psyche. I mean, everybody can kind of Freudianism has infected and infiltrated the popular conscience enough that most listeners surely know this. But Freudianism basically assumes that a person's consciousness is kind of like an iceberg, where only the conscious part of it, the part that you are aware of, that's the part above the surface, but the vast majority of a person's psyche is actually below the surface and inaccessible to the conscious mind, such that what Freud basically says is repression is in that sort of subliminals, it's the part below the surface. It's a subliminal defense mechanism so that whatever your conscious mind deems to be unacceptable, which would arouse anxiety if it's recalled, the unconscious mind blocks that from the conscious mind. So, this is the idea that, those preachers who are preaching so hard against homosexuality, well, in reality, they probably have repressed homosexual urges that would be unacceptable to them in their conscious mind, but in fact, they have those urges that they've just kind of pushed down, right? So that's one way of thinking about repression, is that, this is something that you, in the conscious ego, have come to regard as something that would be unacceptable to your consciousness, to that ego, to who you say, to your story of who you are. So you push it down and you bury it, and you don't deal with it. Now, that led to the idea that you have memories that get repressed. And basically now, the conclusion has been, yeah, you may have urges and so on that you don't admit to yourself that you have. So in that case, repression, in a more limited sense, is something that does exist. But the idea of actual repressed memories that you have, some trauma in the past that because it's so difficult for your mind to wrap itself around, that you block out that it exists, that actually happened, that is pretty much now dismissed among mainstream psychological research, and so mainstream psychology at this point will say, listen, memories, particularly traumatic memories, don't generally get repressed. It's extremely rare if it ever happens. You're much more likely to be traumatically remember things than you are to not remember the traumatic events. Those are the things that you wake up in the middle of the night in night terrors because it happened. You don't forget it, right?
Yeah.
And of course, this is in the chapter that deals with the epidemic of all of these children being put under, being psychoanalyzed and then determining that they'd been raped or molested, women who had, some form of an eating disorder or whatever, going to a psychoanalyst and then concluding under regression therapy that they had been raped by their father for 11 years and all this. And there's some horrifying examples of this where people were locked up for 30 years. There was a couple in Texas that was running a daycare where the kids eventually accused them. They ended up being accused of running a satanic rituals and all this, and abusing and molesting these children, and none of it was true. But that's what happened. They got locked away for decades because in the 80s and 90s these sorts of things were mainstream. And that chapter is all about that particular scare, and how those notions of repressed memory and all this worked together with this self-justifying pattern among the actual analysts, not just among the so-called victims who were victimized by their analysts.
Yeah.
And that even these highly trained professionals are highly susceptible to this particular tendency. And again, this could probably just as well be applied in another 10 or 15 years. We'll probably be looking back at some of the concerns about campus climate in this period and say, yeah, there was a lot of self-justification going on there. Nobody wanted to disbelieve anything, or nobody wanted to appear not to be an advocate for this or that. And, then it led to these abuses and so on. That's the book that's going to be written in another 10 or 15 years looking at that. Of course, generally speaking, a pretty significantly different situation from, children accusing daycare workers of these sorts of things and those people being put away for so long. A little bit different kind of context. And, there is a serious problem in terms of sexual assault in not just in this country, but has been for forever, unfortunately. But the way that we go about this and the way that we often rush to prosecute and rush to advocate those factors, the way that we do it tends to be driven by this process of confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, self-justification, and so on.
Yeah. Well, anything else from the for nitty-gritty?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably worth mentioning that I thought they did a pretty good job talking about the Crusades and the history and how that kind of goes both ways, in the sense that, well, you can make the case, and some very good historians have made the case that it was a defensive conflict on the side of Christianized Europe, but then on the other hand, how far back do you go? Right? Depending on where you start any different conflict, you can blame either side. And at which point they say, is it really about assessing blame? Or maybe we should just, realize that, again, these factors of cognitive dissonance and narratives and self-justification ultimately lead to this kind of violence. I thought they did a good job with that. Other than that, I should probably also mention that mistakes were made in the recording process of this particular episode. In this case, by me,
which is the first step to non-self-justification, right?
Yeah. We managed to record about the first 45 minutes of this, and unfortunately, it was only recording one half of us. It was recording Eric's side, so then I had to go in and add the voiceovers to try to approximate what I had actually said in the gaps between what Eric was saying for that first 40 or so minutes of the podcast before transitioning back to dialogue. Apparently, the application that I used to record these episodes, there was a change that I was unaware of in terms of a legacy setting that I was using for some filtering of my vocal track that no longer works with the input that I use, so that just transitioned so that it wasn't working, and I didn't pay attention when I started recording. So how about that? Mistakes were made by me in this case, and sorry to the listeners if there was any sort of choppiness in that first part. If not, then just remember, I am, of course, a vocal professional, and if you need voiceover work done that is persuasive and convincing voice acting as though I was actually a part of the conversation, then feel free to give me a call, contact me through social media and hire me for your next project.
I like it.
All right, let's go ahead and get to conclusions.
Well, to conclude, I want to read a part here and then make a comment after that. I thought this was one of the better comments in the book. People can remain passionately committed to their nation, religion, political party, spouse, and family, yet understand that it is not disloyal to disagree with actions or policies they find inappropriate, misguided, or immoral. And when the dissonance is caused by something we ourselves did, we keep Perez's third way in mind, articulate the cognitions and keep them separate. In quotes here, when I, a decent, smart person, make a mistake, I remain a decent, smart person, and the mistake remains a mistake. Now, how do I remedy what I did? That first part I wrote, especially about being committed to a cause without in understanding that it's not just loyal to disagree with actions or policies they find inappropriate, misguided, or immoral. I know very few people who can do that. And Jason, I would say that you're one of the few I know that can be passionately committed to something and be able to disagree but not feel like you're disloyal. I have a hard time with that, and
everybody
I think a lot of what we see on social media is people having a hard time with that. If you're committed to a political party, then everything they do, you feel that you have to agree with it and you have to promote it, and that's where a lot of these mistakes can be made. So yeah, that was one of my main conclusions. Is just it was good to read this. It was interesting to read this, but very few people, I think, have been able to do what what they suggest in this book.
And again, I think it's in large part because a lot of people are so unfamiliar with the ways that our minds play tricks on us, and with the way that we do get wrapped up in our own tribe and in defending ourselves rather than working from a sort of dispassionate, listen, I'm not committed to me being right. I'm committed to truth. And that's a really hard position to maintain. Most of us can't live there, and really none of us live there all the time. And you have to be aware of the potential biases in place and be willing to be wrong for that to be the case. You have to actually have a mental commitment. You have to tell yourself a story in which it's okay that you actually might be wrong. Mm-hmm. And most of us, that's really hard for us to do. Fortunately, I had a really good example of this growing up. My dad is a really good example of this. Some of the most formative lessons I got from my dad were, listen, don't act like you know something if you don't. You'll just make a fool of yourself eventually. Just ask whatever you need to ask, go figure out whatever you need to figure out, and actually get to know it. Right?
Well, and the other examples you give of you, even very young, asking him why one thing or another was done, and if he couldn't come back with a good reason, he would concede the point, instead of trying to fight it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in a few cases where he told me something, and I was a young kid, and I came back at him with you did X, and he came back and said, "Yep, you know what? You're right. I'm wrong. I was wrong. I'm sorry." And that example getting set by my dad when I was young was hugely formative, because what he always modeled was, it's not about me being right. It's about what's true. And if you can show me disconfirming evidence, then I'm going to immediately drop whatever position I'm holding, and I'm going to come over to your side. And by watching him do it, and that be the commitment that he lived to, that actually really was formative for me to, and that's one of the reasons why I think I've been a pretty good researcher in my own field, has been, okay, so what if I find out that the position that I've previously held is wrong? Well, why should I stick to it? Now I've seen that there's other disconfirming evidence. Well, let's just find a better model. I'm not married to that. So, that's where, again, I think it's really important for parents to model to kids. One of the most important things we can model to our kids is how to properly respond when we're wrong. Because it's going to happen. What do I do when I make a mistake? Do I teach my kid that I double down on that? Because that's what my kid's going to do. Or do I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's my fault. I was wrong." I think that is one of the most important phrases a kid can hear a parent say is, "I was wrong." I still remember certain examples of my dad doing that, and those were some of the most formative moments for me in my life, is him being willing to do that and him modeling. And he was an official, by the way. He was a referee and an umpire in different sports. And I still remember that at different points he would be in a game, and I remember there was a coach. I was not actually at this game, but this happened on multiple occasions. So I'll tell you the one story where I remember after the fact. But coach just starts climbing all over him, saying, that's a terrible call. And after coach is climbing on him and whatever, getting all over him for missing the call, he just looked at the coach, over on the sideline and said, "Coach, I missed it." Huh. "You're right. I missed the call. Sorry." Well, and he said the coach just looked at him like, "Oh," and just stopped. And he's like, "What can I do about it? I missed it. Sorry."
Yeah.
I'm doing my best here.
And then the way of communicating it, I think, goes back to the title of this book. You could either say mistakes were made and almost put it off on like some imaginary third person, or you could do as the example you just gave. I missed it, or I made a mistake. Not mistakes were made. And I think it's a slight difference, but it's a huge difference.
It's a massive difference, and it totally changes. Once we get into the habit of doing it, once you learn to say that, it's so liberating.
Yeah.
And again, watching my dad do that and him chuckling after that game going, it's amazing what a difference it makes once you don't double down on your bad calls.
Yeah.
And he had so much respect from various coaches. I mean, people wanted him to do their games as an official because he was a guy that was honest. I missed it, Coach.
I would love to see that, just to have a camera on that coach, because that coach wants to keep, he probably didn't even hear your dad immediately say that, I missed it. he already was thinking of the next reaming thing he was going to give him, and then I missed it. Wait.
And
what?
Those are the people we want to be doing our games. Because the guy that can actually admit, I missed that call. That's the guy that, that's the guy that I want to be officiating. So the last thing here for me, in terms of big picture stuff, is this section toward the end where it's talking about monsters, the people who've committed atrocities. And it says, this is one of the most thoroughly documented findings in social psychology, but it's also the most difficult for many people to accept because of the enormous dissonance it produces. What can I possibly have in common with perpetrators of murder and torture? It's more reassuring to believe that they are evil and be done with them. We dare not let a glimmer of their humanity in the door, because it might force us to face the haunting truth of Pogo's great line: we have met the enemy and he is us. And basically what they get at is, they mentioned Ricardo Orizio, who interviewed 7 dictators, including Idi Amin, Jean-Claude Duvalier, Mira Markovic, that's Slobodan Milosevic's wife, and others. And every one of them claimed that everything they did, torturing or murdering their opponents, blocking free elections, starving their citizens, looting their nation's wealth, launching genocidal wars, was done for the good of their country. And if you know anything about Hitler was no monster in his own mind. Hitler, and he was not insane. This is one of those things. I mean, I've taught multiple courses on Jewish-Christian relations through the ages. I've taught multiple courses that have spent a lot of time on the Holocaust. And one of the things that my students invariably come back with after they've read documents on this stuff and they've looked into what's going on, they come back, and it's always one of the most gratifying moments of those semesters. My students come back and go, this is really, really disturbing to me, because I used to think that if you could just go back in history and kill Hitler, that, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. But now I realize, it would have happened without him. Somebody else would have done it. And not only that, it could totally happen here. We could do the same thing. Yeah. That right there, that realization, if you can get that out of anything, again, it's a horrible realization that the monster that was Adolf Hitler was really just he actually took certain philosophical positions of his day, and he was remarkably consistent, and he believed he was doing the right thing.
And that's a lot scarier than
frightening.
Being able to say he was insane.
Yeah, that's frightening.
Yeah.
Because all of us could turn into that, given the wrong first decision, and then getting pushed to the wrong second decision, and eventually you're at the bottom of that, and you are a dictator, or you're a torturer in Abu Ghraib, or it's easy. It would be easy for any one of us to become that, and that's what this book really gets at. That's where I think this book is pretty darn valuable.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy it as much as you did, and the other thing going on with me is that I just finished one of our other books, The Power of Persuasion, which it was funny. At the end of The Power of Persuasion, I put a note, said, I've heard a lot of these examples before, and I was trying to remember where I heard them, and I think they were mostly from Mistakes Were Made. And so my question, because Power of Persuasion was written earlier than Mistakes Were Made, so my question was, is this such common knowledge now that I knew of all these examples, or had I read them elsewhere? And so it's coming back to me now that Mistakes Were Made was the source of a lot of those. So it'll be interesting to talk about that one too, because Power of Persuasion goes a lot more into the sales side of things and how we can be suckered in by marketers, salesmen, and that sort of thing. But they also talk a lot about the examples from this book as well, especially the shock shock thing that they did, and he goes into that a lot more. So I got the two books confused a lot now when I was thinking about them, but going through the notes and then having the discussion with you about this, it did bring a lot of the good parts of this book, and I have a lot more respect for the book now. I think part of me too, while I was reading it, was, is this true? Because a lot of it was different than what I had heard or read in the past. So I was encouraged to hear from you also that a lot of this is cutting edge and good stuff. So yeah, I mean, that marriage chapter, even if you don't read anything else, I would get the book and go to the marriage chapter, and just even reading that one, it's chapter 6 is worth it. I mean, the whole book is worth it, but that marriage chapter especially it set it apart for me.
Yeah, that marriage chapter and the chapter on memory, which goes hand in glove with that. Though I would say, if you're going to read anything, read those chapters, and they're terrific. All right, well, that's going to do it for us today. Now, before we get out of here, just a reminder that you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com. You can also contact us, interact with us on Twitter or Instagram at Books of Titans.
And let me make one comment about booksoftitans.com. If you're enjoying what we're doing and want to think of, or trying to think of a way to support us at all of the pages of our website that have information about the books, they all have links to purchase the book, and those are Amazon affiliate links. So if you're going to be buying one of these books and on Amazon, it's not going to cost you any more if you just click the purchase book link from our website, and then anything you buy gives us a little cut. So I wanted to mention that. We've got reviews on the website. The podcast is on the website. What we're reading, where we're at in the process is all there. But yeah, if you want to support us that way, that's one way you could immediately do it.
Yeah, and once again, if you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to this podcast and find all of our past episodes through Apple Podcasts, the Android Marketplace, or whatever podcast manager you use. We both use Overcast. We feel like that's the best one out there, but either way, if you're enjoying this podcast, please make sure to give us the highest possible ratings you can, whether that's 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Share your favorite episodes on social media. Buy the books through Books of Titans website. We'll be back soon to discuss the next book, which will be Ogilvy on Advertising. On behalf of Eric Rostad, I'm Jason Staples. This has been the Books of Titans podcast. Keep reading, keep listening, and keep improving.
And keep it real.